The Mountain Lion by Jean Stafford. Chapter 6. Mrs. Fawcett and her elder daughters on their way west from Rachel's commencement met Ralph and Molly late in June in Denver. As in former years, when only their mother had been with the children, they stayed at the Brown Palace Hotel. While Leah and Rachel and Mrs. Fawcett were shopping and Molly was at the Museum of Natural History, Ralph sat in the lobby where one looked up past gallery after gallery to a fretted dome, and he imagined the days of the gold and silver harvest, when towns sprang up in the mountains to exist for a few opulent years and then to be abandoned. The train that took them to the Barquet passed through several of these ghost towns. The sagging, rotten, tall, Victorian houses, windowless and with the porches maimed, still wore traces of their original elegance, and there was something deeply mournful in the sight of a cupola whose gingerbread remained intact, but which listed like a hat on a drunk man's head. Patches of gilt still clung to the pillars of the boarded-up opera houses, the saloons and gambling dens, as haggard as death itself still wore their flush names. The Golden Horn, the Gold Nugget, the Silver Dollar, the Silver Moon. The mouths of old mines yawned blackly besides the pyramids of ore. Grass grew in the streets, all the houses were tenantless, and even the trees looked dead. The Brown Palace had been part of those days, and while it was as flamboyant as ever, with its profusion of marble, of tall rubber plants, of gilt-framed mirrors, and of frescoes, it failed to recall the life of the El Dorado as clearly as did the derelict opera houses. It seemed like any hotel in Los Angeles, and the businessman who sat in the modern leather lounge chairs smoking good cigars were pale-faced and stout, not Westerners. Only occasionally did ranchers, unmistakable by their gait and their hewn faces under tall buff hats, amble through the lobby like restless dogs. Uneasy in their city clothes, they picked the chairs behind the rubber plants so that they would not be seen. The others, the buyers and the sugar merchants, were often in the company of women who were too young to be their wives, and Ralph, against his will, were pleased by this, just as he was pleased that his mother and Leah and Rachel were the objects of admiring, libidinous stares when they came into the dining room. On the eve of their departure, the family gathered in Mrs. Fawcett's bedroom for a farewell visit. Mrs. Fawcett talked of her grief at leaving her two babies behind, but brightly promised that they would have their trip around the world in that most far-off future someday. She was grateful for her own bravery in being thus able to face a year without them, but said she knew that it was for their own good. "It will be very good for you to be on your own. Grandfather Bonnie used to say solitude is the greatest tonic in the world. Loneliness is the poison put into solitude by weaklings and cads, and I know you aren't either of those. Molly, you must ask Winifred to use the fine comb on your hair after you wash it, and when we come back, you'll see how quickly time passes. We will all be together in a lovely new home in Connecticut." Molly, who had been captious for days, said, "How many times must I explain to you that it isn't correct to use the word home in that way? You mean house." Mrs. Fawcett smiled patiently. "Very well, my dear, house, since you know so much more than your mother. May I continue what I was saying when you interrupted me?" "Molly, you are becoming an intellectual snob," said Rachel, taking out a gold and white Cody's compact she had got for graduation. "Becoming," said Molly. "I've been one ever since I was nothing going on one." Ralph, while he was in entire agreement with Molly on the distinction between house and home, and had in fact suggested it to her in the first place, hated the smirk on her thin, ill-natured mouth, and hated the unblinking vigil of her nearsighted eyes. This disconcerting stare often caused people to falter nervously in their speech or to flush, and frequently in front of company, her mother scolded her. "Molly, dear, you must not stare. It is very much like pointing." And in school, these eyes, missing nothing, intimidated her teachers, already intimidated by her intelligence and her talent for writing themes of a savagely satiric nature. Everyone said that she had the brains of the family, But as Mrs. Fawcett was not interested in brains, she thought this a handicap rather than otherwise, and often told Molly that there were other things in life besides books. But, thought Ralph, what else could there be for that scrawny, round-shouldered, tall thing, misanthropic at the age of 12? It was curious that she bore so close a resemblance to him. She had the same coarse, straight black hair, the same heavy eyebrows, and the same prominent nose that looked as solid and as unbreakable as a stone. But in a girl, such ruggedness was not handsome as it was in him. And Uncle Claude and nothing could be done to improve the features, nor probably would she have permitted any alterations even if they had been possible, for she took a vindictive pleasure in her plainness. She would stand before the mirror in the hall, and when someone passed by, she would point to her reflection and say, Admit I'm prettier than Mary Pickford." Looking at his older sisters with their fine, tender faces, their shining hair, their dresses of flowered pongee, catching their clean, delicious smell of soap and talcum powder, he wished Molly had never been born. He was still contemptuous of the others, but he was so conscious of their beauty that sometimes he desired, to his horror, to put his lips on their smooth white necks, or on the long green veins in their arms. They had been completely oblivious of Ralph and Molly, and had talked about esoteric things like the Winter Carnival, and the Yale Harvard game, the sixth form dance at St. George's, and Olivia's coming out. Mrs. Fawcett's voice went chattering on, joined sometimes by Leia's or Rachel's. Once Rachel said, "But, Mummy, I think it will be too poky not to stay in Paris for at least 2 months." Ralph and Molly exchanged glances, and each formed the word "Mummy" soundlessly. It was hot. Ralph's pants stuck to the varnished chair, and he drank water slowly out of a sweating hotel pitcher. He gazed greedily at his sisters, and the desire to kiss them became almost irresistible, so that he had to blind himself from time to time by staring into the blazing ceiling light. Then suddenly he thought of Winifred Brotherman, and in an instant he was floundering in his first real love. For a few minutes he sat motionless. Then, from somewhere in the hotel, a jazz band began to play, "The Sweetheart of Sigma Chi." The woodwinds grieving their hearts out, the dancers he imagined with their eyes closed, the dimmed lights he saw, the smell of the girl's perfumed hair, and of the boy's breath sweet with gin, made him tremble like a tree. He thought of her as he had seen her once last summer, lying on the lawn, a bottle of Coca-Cola, half drunk, forgotten, in her hand. The sun seemed to darken her skin as he watched, and her curls looked molded out of metal. He had been pleased to look at her, and now he understood why he had stood so long at his window looking down at her, keeping Uncle Claude waiting for the knife to skin a beaver. On the pretext of a headache from the movie they had gone to in the afternoon, he went to his own room across the hall and lay in the darkness with his hands crossed on his chest. The music here was louder than it had been in his mother's room. Each time the tempo changed, the scene in his mind changed. With the foxtrots, he imagined them dancing, although he did not know how to dance. With the waltzes, he saw them sitting in Uncle Claude's car in the darkness, outside the dance hall, or driving up Cuthbert Pass, until they came to an unfrequented road where they would park the car to kiss for hours. This was nothing like what he had felt for artists. That had been a sweet and nebulous romance, and its only incidents were that once she had given him a valentine and had blushed, and said that someone else must have signed her name, and once he had blown her a kiss. They had loved in their silences and in their sidelong glances exchanged in study hall. It gave him a sense of almost conjugal comfort to know that Winifred was 3 years older than himself. It did not occur to him that she might already be spoken for. He felt that this was not a sudden miracle, but that it had been prepared for since he was a little boy, and it must therefore have been simultaneously prepared for in her. How curious it was that in all these years he had barely been aware of her. How curious that she had seemed to dislike him. Toward 11 o'clock there was an intermission, and when the music ceased, his mind wandered perversely to Leia's high, cool forehead, and as if he were already married and already unfaithful to his wife, he exultantly felt her enclosed in his arms while he first put his lips and then the tip of his tongue upon the small blue vein which marked it like an artist's signature. Then, when the music began again and he returned to Winifred, he fashioned out of his sister and out of memories of girls in movies and girls in books the rival to whom he would allude in his first days with her. He wished to miss nothing, and he remembered, at first with pain, that she would be away at college. He rejoiced that there would be love letters, and that she would come home for the Christmas holidays, and then in the spring. He whirled round and round in his rapid love. It pricked him on the breastbone like a needle. He wanted to be shut up in a small space to think about it. He wanted to grab it and eat it like an apple so that nobody else could have it. At the train, Mrs. Fawcett and Leah and Rachel all cried, for departures and railroad stations required sorrow, and they honored ceremony. They had brought farewell presents. Mrs. Fawcett's and Rachel's were boxes of candy, but Leah gave them nothing except an envelope which she pressed into Molly's hand, telling her not to open it until the train left. Kissing them all goodbye, Ralph felt a twinge of envy of the boat they would sail on, but he did not fail, as Molly stubbornly did, to wish them a bon voyage, when his mother said, "Now, aren't you going to wish us a bon voyage?" He and Molly waved from the observation platform until they could no longer see three separate figures, but only a single clump, and then they went back to the rusty green seat where their presents were. They opened the envelope first. On a sheet of thin Japanese writing paper with a heading of 2 ladies drinking tea, Leah had written, "Dearest Molly girl and Ralphie boy, Mother made me promise not to tell, but she can't do anything now, since by the time you read this, I will be on my way to China. On the 3rd finger of my left hand, I am now the proud wearer of a diamond ring. Mother is quite silly, don't we all know it, and says I cannot announce my engagement for a whole year, and that's why I have to go around the whole darned old world. Of course, she's the limit, but I must say I'm looking forward to the Taj Mahal, not to mention the Holy Land. Garden of Eden, here I come. Right back where I started from. Apologies to California. If you are good and don't breathe this to a soul, I'll bring you back a whole trunk full of presents and will write you every day about what we have seen and the adventures we have had. I will hang my clothes on this line. Loads of love, Leah. P.S. The donor of the famous engagement ring is named Robert Appleton, and he is a senior at Dartmouth. I'd give anything to see your faces when you read this." Molly went over the letter, sentence by sentence, devastatingly, and when she came to the parody of "California, here I come," she put her hand over her mouth and said, "Hasten, Jason, bring the basin. Oh, too late, bring the mop." Recently, she had been very much attached to the word bourgeois, and she used it as if it were the most venomous in the language. She had once said to her mother that she thought the cirrhosis was as bourgeois as all outdoors, and of artist Westerlin, once she had recovered from the shock of her insult, she said, "Why should I bother about that lousy bourgeois stick in the mud?" So now Leah's letter, Leah herself, and the trip around the world were, she said, the most bourgeois things she had ever heard of in her life. "Bonnie bourgeois," she said with finality. Ralph was deeply disturbed by the effect of the letter on himself, feeling somehow cheated, and furthermore he was ashamed that Leah, engaged to be married, was the very figure he had meant to use to rouse Winifred's romantic jealousy. He felt as well a terrified guilt, as though he had despoiled his own sister, and now, to make everything even more sinful, her letter, a clear confession of a relationship with a boy, tempted him again to think of her high forehead, and again to imagine his lips upon it. The wickedness fluttered round him like a moth miller, which he could not catch. As a safeguard against betraying himself, he changed the subject quickly and said, "Will I be glad to see old Studebaker?" And Molly said, "Will I be glad to see Eye Opener?" Now they were really glad to be going to the ranch, and they talked with amiable venom of their mother and sisters, and said that, among other blessings, they would not have to hear Mr. Follansby again as long as they lived. They planned and remembered, and then Ralph, looking in a pause at Molly's hand, which was still puffy and blue, pointed to it and said, "Why did you do that?" But Molly said, "I'm through talking now," and opened Les Miserables, so that Ralph had to contemplate once more his evil thoughts. At the end of 10 miles, he was already tired, and Molly was deep in her book, leaving it only now and again to goggle at the open box of candy on the seat beside her, and, with maddening regularity, to select a gumdrop. The journey always made Ralph homesick, not for people or for a place, but for cleanliness and comfort and orderly houses. For always on the train were the most pathetic travelers in the world, not the ranchers returning from Denver or Omaha, rumpled but still well dressed, and not the rodeo riders on their way from Pendleton to Frontier Days in Cheyenne, nor the dudes in their mottled silk shirts and 10-gallon Stetsons, but the others who belonged in no classification. Every year there was always a group consisting of a gaunt young woman and 3 or 4 small children who ate graham crackers out of an oiled paper parcel and whined nasally. Years of hard work and bad food had given the women a canine look in the mouth and eyes. Their skin was brown and old. If their teeth had been replaced, the false ones were gold, but generally there were only spaces where they had rotted and fallen out. The groups carried little, but they could not always have been the same one, for the children were the same size. The mother's hair was always reddish-brown and hung about her sunken face like dirty strings, but her children were tow-headed, and their eyebrows were too light to see. Sometimes they had skin diseases, or birthmarks, or Hutchinson's teeth. If another passenger struck up a conversation with the mother, the car usually learned that they had been to Denver to a doctor, and the complaint was always something dangerous like mastoid or rheumatic fever. They would get off some hours before Ralph and Molly did at a bleak, treeless town where a mustard-colored depot and a mustard-colored water tower glared in the sun, where small cottages and outhouses with drooping doors straggled up the dry sides of the foothills. The halts were so long that it was often possible to watch the whole progress of the woman and her children up the dirt road onto the porch of the house itself. They moved so slowly they did not seem to be glad to be at home at all. The scene gave Ralph great thirst, and when the train moved on again, he would go to the back of the car and drink cup after cup of tepid water. This time the woman wore a tall tan hat which sat on her head like a pail. It was spotted with mildew. Her dress was a sleeveless evening frock of azure georgette, and its scalloped skirt was longer in the back than in the front. A flower made of orange crinoline with spiny, lifelike pistils was pinned to her shoulder, and she wore a choker of pink beads. As the train mounted to the high country and it grew chilly, she put on a black satin coat with a neckpiece that looked like toasted cotton. She smoked cigarettes in a carved bone holder and ground them out on the floor of the car with the heel of her tennis shoe. There were only 2 children this time, a little girl of about 3 and a boy a little older. They stared vacantly with pale blue eyes at their fellow passengers and ate Cracker Jack with their mouths open, forgetting what they were doing and almost allowing the boxes to fall from their laps, spilling their contents everywhere. They were silent for the most part, but now and again, for no visible reason, they wailed loudly as if they were in pain, and then stopped as abruptly as they had begun. They absent-mindedly plucked at the tussocks of their mother's collar, and she told them without any feeling to lay off of me. He tried to read The Girl of the Limberlost and could not. He worked at the crossword puzzle in the Denver Post, but gave up when he came to the sobriquet of Ferdinand II. He endeavored, and in vain, to feel the rapture of last night, and even hummed to himself some of the songs they had played. Glowworm, Sleepy Time Gal, I'm Looking Over a 4-leaf clover. He fled from Leia's face, but it gained upon him, and was before his mind's eye doll-like and china white. The train, the slowest on earth, seemed to rocket up the peaks and hurtle down the valleys and through the long tunnels, taking him at this mad rate miles away from Leia, miles on the way to Winifred, whom now he was bound in conscience to love, in order to purge from his heart the unholy image of his sister. At noon they went into the forward car, where there was a small buffet at one end. An amiable Negro sold dry ham sandwiches and coffee of a strange buttery flavor. Opposite Ralph and Molly, sitting with a table between them, were 4 ranchers drinking whiskey out of lily cups. Farther up the car was a sandy-haired little man with a small, spiteful mouth and blue pop eyes. He wore a cerise silk neckerchief and a black and yellow braided belt. His Levi's were stiff and new, and he had turned up the cuffs to show his black boots with curlicues burned into the tops of them. He had a bottle, too, but he did not fool with a lily cup. Instead, he put the bottle to his mouth and gurgled loudly. Molly continued to read as she ate, having made the statement when they came in that Napoleon was a man she wished she had known platonically. Ralph gazed out the window at the deep gorge of the Wolf River, full and foaming from the big thaws. The train slowed down so much for a steep grade that he saw a fat woodchuck calmly eating something on a rock at the edge of the track bed. They came then into a brilliant valley checkered with neat fields, and here the river was deeper in the color of dark, dim gold. A large Germanic man who smoked a pipe said when they stopped at Peacetown and he had scrutinized the landscape, "Don't Luke Fisher live up there? Yonder, I'm talking about, past them cottonwoods? Seems to me like he does." His companions first agreed, then doubted, then denied, and it was established finally that Fisher lived 27 miles to the east. But this did not dissuade the speaker, as it would not have done a man at Uncle Claude's table, from talking further of Luke Fisher. He did mighty well with them kids after his wife died, that's one thing you can say for him. All of them but the oldest boy and that one Milton turned out ornery as a bobcat. You ever hear about the time he was working for Roger Campbell and turned loose a stallion with the saddle horses? You know the stallion I mean? He was an ugly bastard of a paint with one blue eye. Campbell bought him off Prescott and sold him to some blooded dude here a while back for $7,000. Well, this here Milton, Milt they called him, was wrangling Campbell's horses up there one summer. Campbell used to have a whole hell of a lot more dudes than he's got now. Don't ask me why, 'cause I don't know. Anyway, I guess this Milt got a hold of a bottle of rot gut whiskey and drank it one Saturday night, because the next Sunday morning when the dudes went out to get on their horses, there wasn't anything in the world in the corral but that bald-faced stallion kicking the bejesus out of every goddamn bench on the place. Campbell had him some good horses, too. Bought a colt off him myself once, pretty near the finest horse I ever had. Ken Burkhart's got her now, down to Kenyon's place. It was not unusual for Ralph to hear his uncle's name in these conversations. Indeed, he could not remember a time when Uncle Claude had not come up in connection with something or other, and it gave him a sense of security and pride. His name was as well known here, as much taken for granted, as that of President Hoover. Sometimes he and Molly talked loudly to establish their identity so that the men would speak to them, but they never did, although usually they knew who the children were. And when they got off at White Woman, someone would look out the window and say, "Well, there's Kenyon's pickup, so the kids won't have to walk home." Between swallows, the solitary man cut his nails with a jackknife and whistled tunelessly between his teeth. He finished his whiskey as they sat there, and when he had tucked the bottle away under the seat, he smiled at the men across the aisle. His smile was only a physical adjustment of his lips. It was like the grin of a panting dog. He spoke with a Texas accent. He said, "I don't like to horn in on you boys if you're discussing something private, but I was studying on maybe one of you all having an extra bottle of corn whiskey that I could buy off you. I aim to stock up better than I done, but I'm a stranger to Denver, and only got just this one pint. Hadn't stocked up on the password was my trouble." There was a pause during which he did not close his mouth. The four men shrewdly sized him up, and although it was clear that they did not approve of him, one of them nevertheless fetched down his valise from the luggage rack and got out an unlabeled pint bottle. The Texas handed him $3 silver, and the man pocketed them wordlessly. The stranger drank, and then to the men who had not taken their eyes off him, he said, "Well, no offense intended, but that ain't worth $3, and it ain't worth $2. If a man felt right free, he might give 6 bits for it. By Jesus, they got us coming and going between the goddamn government and the goddamn bootleggers." His listeners' faces were expressionless. Presently, the tall Germanic man said, "Where are you from?" "Well, mister, as of 75 hours, 45 minutes ago, I'm from San Fernando Hospital, San Antone. I laid on a bed for 6 holy months. Broke my leg, bulldogging a steer on Christmas Day." He had recovered now and was on his way to Laramie to put on an exhibition for a millionaire and his pals who had hinted of Madison Square Garden. "Can you feature a rodeo indoors?" he said. "I can't, but Mama dear, I can feature the cash in the New York dude's jeans." He had never been through this country before, he said, but in Reno once last November he had met a man from here. He had met him at a gambling table, and he would swear on a stack of Bibles that he had never seen a man with such luck. I can't call his name, though I'd remember it if I heard it. But anyway, that man had the most gorgeous luck I ever saw in my born days. He won him $125 before he said quit, and if I'd have been in his place I would have gone on, but then I always was a sucker. It was agreed finally that the lucky gambler was Homer Armitage, and the details of his fortunate career were reported how, at Spit in the Ocean, he had bluffed his way into a $20 pot, had never been known to lose a cent at stud, and was the one man in 10,000 that could make a slot machine pay off. The stranger said, "He cheats, don't he?" and grinned. The foreman sat up straight, and the one who had given him the whiskey said, "You ought to watch the way you talk, mister. Homer Armitage don't cheat, and you're among his friends." Molly looked up from her book and, laughing noiselessly, said, "Ride 'em, cowboy." Ralph, who until then had seen nothing amusing in the native's defense of a fellow citizen against an outlander, scowled, annoyed that, as usual, she was twice as quick-witted as he even, though she appeared to be absorbed in her book. After that, the Texan drank in silence, sucking his bottle like a baby, and the others did not speak to him again but went on talking of Homer. When his luck at cards had been exhausted, one of them said, "Here, Armitage bought a quarter interest in Kenyon's place. The man's got the money to do that. I don't see why he don't get his own place. It ain't any good working for somebody else." "Kenyon ain't bad to work for," said another. "He pays his men good." A yellow-haired and cross-eyed man said, "Here, Kenyon's going to get married." "You don't say. To who?" "I haven't got the foggiest, just something my wife picked up and told me. She didn't know either. I asked her." "Well, it's time. It ain't that girl Kennedy's, is it? The one that has the school up to the Forks?" "Christ, no. She's Harmon Tucker's girl." "Well, I'll be damned. I wonder who it is." Molly closed her book and, leaning across the empty plates and cups, whispered, "Did you hear that? Do you know what I think? I think Uncle Claude is going to marry Magdalene." He did not bother to be irritated with her. The thought was immediately in his mind that Uncle Claude was going to marry Winifred, and now the blustering passion of last night returned. Imperfectly, as if he looked through waves of heat, he saw his sister's forehead furrow with surprise, and then smooth out again as her lips curled in a smile whose intention he could not grasp. He thought, "What has given me away?" But Molly said nothing and prepared to go back to the other car. For one interminable moment he sat still. The train was picking up speed, for they were coming down off Booth Pass. Between this and Cuthbert there was a ride of 3 more hours, during which they would pass through 14 tunnels, one of which, the longest, they were rushing toward now. This was the part of the journey he and Molly had always looked forward to. Sometimes they saw a man standing in a niche at the side, the pale light from the lamp on his cap giving his grimy face a corpse-like luminosity. Once a bat had flown against the very window at Molly's elbow. As Ralph lurched through the buffet car, he heard the train hoot, protracting its note of warning so long that he knew they were almost at the mouth of the tunnel. By the time he had passed through the vestibule, the lamps in the car were turned on. They were not powerful, and the blackness of the tunnel, even at its entrance, was so complete that the light was crepuscular. Coal smoke forced back from the locomotive seeped through the door of the observation platform. His mouth already tasted foully of sulfur. He made his way toward Molly. The woman with the children leaned out into the aisle as he passed by, and she said in a flat voice, "You got a match?" He flushed in the dimness as he shook his head, ashamed that he did not smoke. He saw that she wore no wedding ring. He sat down beside Molly, although the seat in front was pushed back so that they could be opposite one another. Partly he did not wish her to read any further in his face, and partly he wanted to feel her nearby. He thought of her as if she were the last foothold beneath which the world fell away in a chasm. It would be so easy to lose his footing, relax his finger holds, and plunge downward to wedge his bones in a socket of rocks. Vile fogs baffled him, and vileness was below him. Molly alone, he thought, did not urge him to corruption. For the moment he was protected by her elbow and her knee, which touched his, and by the sexless odor of her new white shirt, which she wore with a pair of black sateen Jim bloomers. He saw the tunnel as an apotheosis of his own black. Sinful mind which had incestuously coveted Leah, he trembled to think of Mr. Robert Appleton, and the girl who might well be his aunt by marriage. The mind that had observed with delight that the mother of the seedy children had no wedding ring. He urged the train to make haste. Once out in the bright green meadows of the valley, he thought he would be safe from the thoughts that swarmed about him like a dream of reptiles. As long as Molly was here beside him, though, he could hang on. And then he knew he had been wrong, that he was not safe. He was weakening and ready to fall, and now he actually slumped down in the seat so that his shoulders were on a level with Molly's, and he said, in the lowest voice, "Molly, tell me all the dirty words you know." He heard himself almost with relief. Before there was time for Molly to move away or to utter a cry, they had emerged into the light, which streamed like glory through the dirty window panes. The sun was high and the fields shimmered. Round them, for miles as far as the eye could see, were the violet mountains, clean-lined, clear of haze. The eye could not detect a single impurity in all the scene. Ralph's childhood and his sister's expired at that moment of the train's entrance into the surcharged valley. It was a paradox, for now they should be going into a tunnel with no end, now that they had heard the devil speak.